Thank you all so much for coming back. My name is Sarah Groh. I'm part of our America Forward team, and we are so grateful to have this panel here with us today. As a diehard Red Sox fan, I'm surprised no one's actually brought up that about this venue yet, but we're very excited to be here. And Jacek and I were talking about how we're in an interesting place in the batting order, but for a really critical conversation. So thank you all for coming back and engaging with us on this. By way of opening here, I just wanted to reference something that Superintendent Margarita Ruiz said earlier today. She talked about how as we're having critical conversations about policy right now, our kids are waiting for us. And so we're here today to have a conversation about policy making and opportunities for influence at the federal, state, and local level, and convey a critical sense of urgency and opportunity to you all. I think it's really critical that folks in this room are deeply engaged in these conversations in partnership. So with that, let me introduce our esteemed panel. We're thrilled to have here with us today Mayor Kim Driscoll from Salem, Massachusetts, Dan French from the Center for Collaborative Education, Jacek Pruski from America Forward, Danica Petrosius from Penn Hill Group, and Bridget Rodriguez from the Education Redesign Lab. Thank you all so much for joining us. Great. So Mayor Driscoll, let's start with you as we get into this conversation here today about policy and the urgency around the programs we're delivering together and engagement at the state and local level. You and your team are leading some breakthrough efforts in Salem together with the superintendent. We'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your vision for education in your city.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having us. And can't say enough about the strong partnership we forged outside of Salem to help us think about, the best moves for us inside of Salem. I think many folks may be familiar with our community and having a few thousand people visit us in October, but we're so much more than just an October Halloween destination. We're a pretty diverse place, 45,000 people, only 14 miles north of Boston, with a school district that encapsulates more of an urban district. Very diverse group of individuals who are there. That shifted pretty quickly in the last 20 years. And I would say, to our detriment, the way we thought about public education didn't shift as fast as the population was. So we definitely have had some catching up to do within our community and with our ability to serve all kids. My own children have been in Salem Public Schools and couldn't have been happier, and there's lots of kids that we serve really well. But there were children and families that we weren't serving really well, and that became pretty evident through a lot of the work that DESE does and the reviews and the assessments. And we've worked hard to have a turnaround effort, not just in one school, but really a system-wide turnaround effort. We like to think of education as a community mission, and we want to transform the system that we have. So we're this small city, but we really punch out of our weight class with respect to the partners that we have in Salem, the PBD Essex Museum, the National Park Service, an array of youth service organizations, Salem State University, originally a teacher's college, a real rich array of partners who want to help our schools but aren't really sure how. And a committed group of leaders and educators within our community who want to do more, but really aren't sure what to do with respect to a diverse educational setting. Fast forward to today, we've got new leadership that I think has both the technical know-how, the experience, can capture hearts and minds. We brought some partners in to help us really think about what our goal is for education. And frankly, rather than getting caught up in DESE's level 1, 2, 3, or 4, we want to reframe how we think about educating all children in Salem and making sure that they have the support systems around them, not as a community school model, but as a community model. So for us, we've expanded learning time in 4 of our schools. Kids get free breakfast and lunch. We've brought in City Connects across our entire district to really help us think about the broad array of wraparound services that we need in our community. How do we make sure we're all speaking the same language and we're worried about that 80% of waking hours when kids aren't in school, as much as we're worrying about the time that we have them between our doors from 8 and 3. And I would say for us, it's also about building that accountability at a city level. If we've got a whole community focused on education, that's a big difference for us, and I'll pick on a community, Newton or Brookline. You go to change the high school program of studies in Newton or Brookline, and you're probably going to have a fist fight about, are there 12 languages or 14 foreign languages? We don't have that in Salem. We have a lot of thoughtful, well-meaning people, but there isn't this engagement around education, and we need that kind of accountability if we want to sustain this, and we need all of those partners and all of the richness that they bring to help us provide the level of services and supports that we need, not only to kids, so that they're having an engaging and challenging and supportive experience, but also for our staff, who also need to be supported and engaged and challenged. And I think the stars are really lined up. We've got good leadership. You heard from our superintendent, Margarita Ruiz. We've got a strong team around her. And I've mentioned those partners that we have in our community who are all brimming with optimism, and we're seeing that progress work. We're not where we need to be, but we really feel like we've got the recipe, and we're working it hard.
Great, thank you so much. Bridget, I'd love to pull you in on this conversation. You've worked in partnership with many folks in Salem. You also bring background working in the Massachusetts Executive Office of Education, and now you're focused on impact at the municipal level. Can you tell us a little bit about the initiative that you're driving, as well as what you see as the opportunity for influence locally?
Sure. Yeah, it's really my pleasure to be here on the panel and to be speaking after Mayor Driscoll. So I work at the Education Redesign Lab, which is a fairly new organization housed at the Harvard Graduate School of Ed, founded by our former Massachusetts Secretary of Education, Paul Reville. And a signature part of our field work is a 6-city national consortium called By All Means, which Salem is one of our founding members. And part of our theory of action is that in partnership with city mayors, each city in this national consortium creates a children's cabinet that's a team of cross-sector municipal agency leaders that work with the mayor and the superintendent to think about the lives of children more globally than just schools. So Paul often says that schools as an intervention alone is not enough for us to close the achievement gaps and really create environments where all kids can thrive. So my work with cities like Salem it's been interesting to think a little bit about this panel, because really the work is driven not by federal mandates or policy or money or state policy or money, but really by political leadership. And so it's an interesting different approach to making local change, and I think Salem is a great example of a place without any of those federal incentives or requirements, has, as the mayor indicated, implemented a City Connects model district-wide without any public monies, raising monies locally, and by being creative about redeploying staff within the district and getting staff buy-in to make those kinds of changes in terms of their job descriptions. So it's been different from some of the other work I've done, which has been at the state level and thinking about ways that state policy can help incent and drive change.
Great, thanks so much. And Mayor Driscoll, you've spoken before about some of that interplay between state agencies and local leadership. We know that a number of folks at the district level also turn to you for leadership on how to do some of this change work. Could you speak a little bit to either some of the conditions, incentives, barriers, how that factors into the strategic work you're leading?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it definitely is helpful to have a solid leadership within your district. We had a school committee that was willing to do a turnaround with our level 4 school, working with an educational partner to stop, work that was going on that we thought wasn't as successful. That is super hard. But we had leadership at the top who recognized that we weren't serving all our kids well. We were just passing kids on to the next level, and to being able to hold ourselves accountable for that not being good enough took a strong intervention. Working with By All Means, we've been able to form a children's cabinet. So we've routinely got people around the table, the head of our community health center, the dean of the School of Education at Salem State University, the head of a nonprofit that works a very successful after-school program, particularly with communities of color and low-income students. So we had people around the table who wouldn't normally be around the table. We have a Salem Partnership. It's a business alliance of nonprofit, private sector leaders within our community who set big visions that we work together. Their number one goal is education, is making sure that we're focused on what are the tools that we need and how do we work together to achieve it. And they're great at it. We've collectively thought about these goals that we want for our community. And as you said, not getting tied up in levels, but what's our report card look like? What's our engagement for families at each school? What's our expectations for that? What's our technology goal for our community? When we think about the progress we want to make, how do we pace that? Those wraparound services, how do we have a system for that? And how do we talk about it that way? So for us, it was definitely having some strong leadership within our school committee to recognize that, but having that accountability with that children's cabinet and people around the table, and going to our newspaper and showing that what we're not doing well and what the goal is to get there. I think was also some of those things that helped us all make hard decisions. We brought our teachers union president as a member of our children's cabinet, so we're not doing it, we're doing it in a very transparent way. We're not doing it behind closed doors. We need to engage all of those stakeholders and try and be honest. And in the past, I think we threw a lot of things at the wall and tried to see what stuck. I think now we're a little bit more focused on recognizing both data and metrics and accountability and where those all intersect, and not being afraid to have other people outside of our school district help us achieve some of that success.
That's a great segue. A question we've heard in this room a lot today is around how can folks effectively partner with districts? And something else that I think is in the air or in the water, Danica and Jacek, I'd love to invite you in on this. We're talking to a lot of organizations right now who want to engage in meaningful and innovative work at the district level or even the state level. Folks are also hearing about opportunities ongoing to engage in ESSA plan implementation. And I think there's a sense of urgency to hold ground in the federal space as well, as we're talking about budget priorities that are in jeopardy or conversations around students with disabilities and civil rights and other protections. So I'd love to invite you both in to offer a candid take on both the partnership question, but also how you're advising organizations to engage.
Sure. So this actually really resonates with the last time we got together with some of the folks in this room as part of the practitioners working group with Reimagine Learning. So America Forward, as I think everyone probably knows, is the nonpartisan policy arm of New Profit. And for the last 5 years, we've been partnering closely with Reimagine Learning on a number of priorities. So leading up to ESSA's passage in December of 2015, fighting for provisions like multiple measures of student achievement, innovation funding, partnership language that's so critical to this work. And since December 2015, a lot has changed. Bob offered some very lively commentary on what some of those changes look like. But we're at a point now in the ESSA process where all the state plans are in, and we're going to increasingly be looking at the local implementation plans. And bringing the group together in September, there were really two big questions, I think, that were on everyone's minds that we got together and learned about and acted on. And those questions were, one, how do we get involved in this ESSA process, including the point, Mayor, that you asked, or the question you asked so well, which is, you want to help but aren't sure how to be a good partner. What are the ways to get involved? How can I be a good partner? How do I set up these partnerships? And then the second big question is just this very scary budget conversation that's been going on for the past year, where you've had, folks have referenced very important federal funding streams that we've seen some pretty dramatic cuts proposed to. The elimination of Title II funding that was proposed by the administration and adopted by the House, cuts to innovation funding that we saw in the House process, and a number of others. And thanks, I think, to a lot of heavy advocacy, we've seen a lot of that funding, but not all of it, restored in the Senate, on the Senate side, and it remains to be seen. And I'd be curious for Danica's take as to what the end game looks like. But I think a lot of this is really resonant with what we're hearing among practitioners, and it makes one question I have for the mayor and for Dana and for Bridget is thinking about what are some really specific examples of partnerships. What have you learned in what you've seen in Salem or in your work, Dan or Bridget? What are lessons that bubble up? What tips do you have for folks in the room that are looking to be good partners?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to at least share a little bit about our experience. So I would say that we have not got this 100% figured out. It's definitely a work in progress, but feel really hopeful about this movement we're creating, Our Salem, Our Kids, that's tapped in to our local partners. So whether it's our local YMCA, who uses their child care program to help serve as vocational leaders as part of our child care program at our high school. This is new this year. Like, you run a child care, we have a child care program at our high school, it's a vocational model. How do we connect all those dots? Salem State University is changing the way they educate their undergrads. You're going to have a 4+1 program there. How do we make sure those students are prepared to work in an urban district in a more meaningful way? That's the superintendent and the dean of education sitting down and figuring out how to make that happen. How does their community of color connect with our students from a community of color with the help of a grant to try and make sure those students are getting some natural mentor and mentee relationships North Shore Medical Center, sometimes it's just cold hard cash. We'll take that too. They funded the City Connects program, through a community benefits agreement. That's super helpful. They're right around the corner, and we're talking with them now about our vocational program at the high school, adding a healthcare component, and what will their role be in that and providing those externships. Those were conversations around the table, understanding what our needs are, where everybody said, our job is to help educate kids in Salem. What can we do? Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's programs, sometimes it's a new program that we're starting together, and breaking down those barriers where the head of the hospital didn't talk to the superintendent, or the dean of the School of the Education didn't sit down for a 2-day cohort at Harvard to talk about how our systems can be better aligned. So I'd say a lot of it for us is communicating, and there was a real recognition. We had a level 4 school, we had a level 4 district. That was a wake-up call for our entire community. We need to have this conversation, this super hard conversation about education, our kids, and how difficult this is. It's not overhauling a park, it's not fixing a road, it's fixing a system or designing a new one in our case.
Well, I think I'll wait till I get to my question.
Sure.
And then I'll
You're deferring. You're
I'm
deferring.
Great.
So Dan and Bridget, I have another to tee up to you here, but Donica, do you want to jump in with any other insights that would build on what Jacek offered?
I've been having so many thoughts in my head the last hours. So the two that come to mind relevant to advocacy, and people who know me have heard me say something like this before, but Tracy's notice of time is, it takes a long time to do this stuff really well. Everybody's racing to do ESSA implementation to the extent that that's important. You're doing local implementation of a lot of different things. And I couldn't figure out how to frame it until I went to the Spring Branch thing. I think your framing of we always have to work at making it great now, but also what's next. You always have to have great and next in the same moment. And that's what I would urge all of us on the policy advocacy. What do you do as advocates? So keep doing what you're doing, but don't just do it. Tell it, record it, evaluate it, tell us, tell everybody in the world, whether it's the mayor or it's a state person or it's a federal person, tell them what's happening now. And then I really plead to funders in the room, start now funding the things that we know will be the next ESSA structures. So we know that we have to have a better assessment system. We know we have to have a better accountability system. In this moment, we did not have that. Something that we felt, that policymakers felt we could grab onto and really trust that we wouldn't lose equity, that we wouldn't lose all the things that I've gained that Bob talked about. So I just urge us to think in that way and not to give up, but all of us have to do it in our own different pieces, or we're gonna lose the whole opportunity. The next time we can really reimagine things, our next opportunity, we should have already defined that ask, already defined that story, and already have it set in place to do. So that's I'm not sure how it relates. It's more up here, but it's where my head is.
Can I build
Please,
on that?
yeah, feel free to.
So I'm gonna actually go to the question that got infinitely more votes than anybody else, with any other question with 1, because everybody else got 0.
I was going to say.
So, and the question was, what do you see as the key barriers to changing education at the state level in education? And and this is where I'm going to disagree with our colleague Bob Pasternak, who spoke a little while ago, that we all know that assessment drives teaching and learning. It drives what goes on in classrooms, and it drives even more so in schools and districts serving high percentages of low-income kids, kids of color, and English language learner, because they're the ones who are placed on the hot seat. So I'm going to actually place my comments on the other side of what Bob talked about. Is while I fully agree that NCLB brought along disaggregating data and paying attention to it, it also brought way more harm than good. In terms of, particularly in the districts that I'm talking about, it promoted teaching to the test. It promoted narrowing the curriculum. It promoted ranking and sorting kids in schools in ways that are just not helpful. It promoted tying teacher evaluation to student learning growth when there's not one iota of research that says that's a credible thing to do. And there's very little research that suggests that teacher evaluation is the right lever to push. And in fact, it's the opposite, teacher growth and investing in teacher growth and development the way Jeff talked about is what we want to do is steer policy at the local, state, and federal level towards reinvesting in teachers and communities and empowering them to take charge and giving them the skills to do so. So I see changing the No Child Left Behind legacy of standardized tests as the biggest challenge we face in moving towards personalized learning, because the assessment needs to match the types of learning and teaching conditions that we envision in our classrooms and that we see in our best schools. Now, and just to underscore, it was Sarah who introduced us to 5 characteristics of deeper learning. So in case you've forgotten, I'll tell you them. Joy, active engagement, meaning, iteration, and social interaction. Now, it's pretty safe to say that standardized testing strikes out on all of those. So if that's true, what do we need to do? We need to change this state assessment and accountability systems. Now, there's a couple of states in the country that are doing it from the top. New Hampshire being one of them. We're 5-6 years into working with the state of New Hampshire to exempt, and they're the one state that has a federal waiver, to exempt them from standardized testing. Smarter Balanced is their test, except for a dipstick in 1 grade per grade span. And the rest of proficiency determinations are being made by teacher-generated, curriculum-embedded, competency-based performance assessments. That's the way you build teachers' skills, is teach them how to create valid, high-quality, curriculum-embedded assessments, and then teach them how to score reliably. So in most states, though, and I'll tell you, I think most people would agree that most SUP plans are pretty tepid in moving off the dime around accountability. And very few states are taking the lead, and that's where we come in, is the grassroots. The movement has to come from the grassroots of districts, teachers, et cetera. So an example being, about a year and a half ago, we launched the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment with 6 districts, including Boston. And it was 6 districts who came together with the superintendents and the teacher union presidents together at the table forming the governing board that made the commitment, if the state isn't going to do it, we're going to do it. We're going to build the kind of accountability system that we want to have. So we start a multiple measures data dashboard with the academic learning. Primary means of doing so is by teacher-embedded performance assessments. So first, we went to the source. We held focus groups in every single of the 6 districts with students, parents, teachers, administrators, community folks, and asked them, what do you most want to know about your schools? And through that, along with a little research on the side, we developed a school quality framework of 5 categories that the public, the community, most wants to see about schools. Teachers and the teaching environment, school culture, character and well-being, resources, and academic learning. That became, we're about to unleash in mid-November, hopefully, our first data dashboard for every single school of multiple indicators under each of those categories, without ranking or sorting anyone, because that only divides people. And it detracts people from what the actual data is saying. And at the same time, we have teacher teams from a quarter of the schools every year engaged in learning how to create high-quality, curriculum-embedded performance assessments that meet tests of validity and reliability. And next summer, we'll be introducing comparability, or scoring cross-district, to ensure that teachers in Winchester, for those of you who don't know, Massachusetts is a high-end district, to teachers in Boston or Revere or Somerville, which are all urban districts. So, and we put the department on notice. We let them know we're doing this, and a couple of years once we get the system built, we're coming to you, and we're going to make the issue a public one. So I do think that's one example, and hopefully it will be successful. But it's one way in which I think the grassroots needs to respond to state and federal policy that is leading us in the wrong direction.
Thanks so much, Dan. I think you've touched on a number of themes that are coming up here in real time in the questions too. A lot of folks weighing in with questions about assessment, accountability, as well as the outsized impact of folks who are doing innovative local work right now. As Jacek mentioned briefly, we were on the Hill a couple weeks ago with about 30 nonprofit leaders from this community, and something that we see often in our work, but I was reminded of again, is how critical it is to have the folks who are doing the work day in and out in the classroom at the district level, engaging with policymakers at every level, and how that fundamentally changes the conversation when we're talking about our kids and we're talking about the vision we want to build 5 and 10 years out, as well as holding ground on some really critical and pressing priorities. So with that, I'd love to invite Bridget in, as well as Danica here, to talk a little bit more about this innovation and accountability space. I think we're seeing some interesting efforts locally. I'd also welcome your take on the interplay right now between the federal dynamics as well as just the timeline that states are up against and some of what's in play. So.
Do you want me to answer? I can give a broad stroke, which is that right now, the innovation and metrics within ESSA accountability, there's only so much innovation space that you can do. You have a required set of things, and then there's things you can add to that. What we're seeing, and again, I'm not judging what states have chosen, but just we're not seeing a whole lot of huge innovation in that area, but you're seeing people look at culture and climate surveys, sometimes just things like PE, access to arts, varying college and career readiness indicators. And that's, the window of opportunity of flexibility that they have right now if they're going to take federal money. So I think that that's what we're kind of seeing as the space. I think that I sort of lost track of the second part of the question, but that's kind of what I think. I totally agree that people see all of the sort of ESSA plans and the opportunity within them as sort of, I guess you said, tepid. Or tentative, or both not very descriptive. It doesn't have a lot of detail. They didn't go overboard in explaining every little thing. There's a lot of TBDs in them. But also not as much the innovation as we hope. And I think that that's not necessarily that it won't actually result in innovation. I think a lot of states and districts want to give time for further reflection and deeper work to make those things happen with partnerships, with their communities and all of that. So I think there's a lot more to see and come.
Well, I just take it a little bit in a different direction. Part of our work has really placed our investments in local municipalities, given the chaotic nature of the national landscape right now, and the idea being that we can work with cities through local leadership to create proof points of systems that are integrating supports for kids. We happen to be looking pretty carefully at chronic absenteeism as one of the metrics that can reveal the myriad of needs for kids. But we've really invested in thinking about how local work can then bubble up to hopefully influence the national conversation.
Great. There are some questions popping up around cultivating local leadership, a few with an eye towards the district level, and others that are a little bit more open-ended. I'm reminded of some conversations earlier today that I've been in with some incredible parent advocates in the room, and youth that are leading some of these dialogues as well. I'd just love to open it up and get reactions from anyone on the panel. I think these are some great questions that we continue to ask ourselves in our work. How do we cultivate leadership at every level, and how do we build bigger tables where more folks can engage in the conversation?
I mean, we've had a teacher's cabinet approach where we've taken, I think our superintendent has really worked hard to bring more teacher leadership opportunities within the district as well. So obviously that's the heart and soul of the work, and wanting to make sure that their voice is heard and supporting them. I think that was one of the biggest for us areas where we really needed to make sure that we were aggressively providing supports for teachers who were being asked to do a lot. and were being held accountable for a lot, but didn't have a lot of coaches, didn't have a lot of opportunities to learn their craft, didn't even have great opportunities to bring them all together. And I think we've really shifted our focus. We have teachers who are now leading our PD efforts. We have teacher leadership opportunities that have doubled since where we were several years ago, and trying to make sure that their input is heard loud and clear as part of our efforts, sending our teachers to wonderful programs so that they can bring that back to our district as well. Those are just some of the areas that we're focused on, I think, for sure. It's a challenge when you've got 500 employees in our district anyways, trying to make sure our paras are now part of our PD. They weren't before. So we're trying to find all those ways that we can make sure they're supported and that their voices are heard.
Absolutely.
Critical.
We have a partnership underway with the folks over at the Council of Chief State School Officers, and one line that I always remember from a convening of leaders that we brought together, they said, never underestimate the power of gas money. What you can do when you just get release time and gas money, right? And you're able to bring educators together as professionals, but also recognizing that there are really significant logistics and operational considerations to create some space to do that. Yasik?
Yes.
Or Dan?
Go ahead.
Oh, so, as I said, if you're going to place your trust and empower teachers, you've also got to sometimes build their skill set. So what we do is we train teacher teams on how to do it, and then we assist them side-by-side facilitation to build the assessment capacity of their entire faculties. So in that way, we're building teacher leaders. We then stipend a select crew to then begin taking over the institutes that we're running. So the goal is, if we're at the front, it's not going to mean much, that we've got to quickly transfer that leadership over teachers and build those skills, because they're the ones who are going to most drive the change.
I also just wanted to offer a perspective on leadership development in the advocacy space, and that's something that we, just in September, we were actively learning on together. And for America Forward as a coalition, and with the Reimagine Learning Network, last November, obviously, as it was for a number of almost everyone, a real reckoning moment. And one of the questions that was on everyone's minds was, what is our coalition going to be thinking in terms of prioritization? Are folks going to look at what Bridget, I think, rightly characterized as a chaotic federal landscape and say, it's really time to focus in on program delivery and local work? And we survey our members every year, and actually we were pleasantly surprised that over 90% of our respondents actually wanted to double down and build their advocacy capacity. So what we heard overwhelmingly was a deep interest actually in continuing to develop skills to do advocacy. And it was in part for that reason that we brought folks together in September and got to watch, just in a day, which is not enough, but is a start, folks go from being, learning about how to tell an impact story, how to talk about what your work does and what its impact is, and how to talk about your evidence in a way that's compelling to your audience. In September, the specific audience we had in mind were Hill offices, both on the appropriation side and some of the authorizers. But it was a skill set that applies across domains, and it was wonderful to learn together and see just in a couple of hours how much storytelling sharpened and got sharper, and people were learning from one another, and it was just a lovely thing to see. And so I just would offer that as a kind of reflection on leadership development, and also I think a little bit about the dynamic in the room about how folks are thinking about how to allocate their resources.
Yeah, please.
I'd also like to put a challenge out to all of us that, we spent a lot of time in the Spring Branch, and it's just where I was in the last hour, talking to them about how they need to do more to engage their community. They need to do more to train teachers and principals to do that. We, all of us in the nonprofit world and others need to also start thinking about it's our responsibility too. Like, we are in schools, have members, we have, whether it's college students or teachers or, after school program, whatever it is, that we all have to have advocacy top of mind, because it's a constant training, but growing and cultivating and that awareness from the get-go. Because if we wait another 7 years, or how many years, 3 years for a certain election, to figure out how to get people engaged, we're too late. But we have so much opportunity right now with all the people you touch, and to help schools do that. It's not just on them to do that. So, and not just the CPLAN, I can't remember all the acronym names, it's not just the parent group that needs to do it either. We can all sort of step in and do that.
I'm going to create an opening for the mayor to make a graceful exit here. Thank you so much for your time. The month of Halloween,
Thank you.
2 weeks out from an election. We are very grateful. Please give the mayor a round of applause. Thank you so much. Bridget, did you want to weigh in on this front?
So we also think about leadership on the cabinet teams that each of the cities brings to Harvard twice a year for 2 days that the mayor alluded to. And part of the idea there is that it's a shared experience, and we've paid particular attention to trying to think about the leadership dimension of this work. So we've partnered with other Harvard faculty, including Ron Heifetz, who's worked a lot with our teams thinking about adaptive leadership, since we're trying to build and do things that we haven't yet figured out how to do. So that's been a component of our work. And not surprised, I mean, we didn't design the convenings with this in mind, but it shouldn't have surprised us that one of the most reported benefits from the teams is the shoulder time that folks get to spend together to build relationships, which really reinforce the working relationships when they're back in their own cities. And it's as important for the teams that are coming from Oakland, California, across the country, as it is for the team coming from Somerville, 1.5 miles away. It's the off-site time together that's been really important.
Yeah, that's such an important reminder. Dan, I'd love to invite you in, and we're getting some questions in particular around your Innovation District framework, but other highlights you'd like to share about the work underway.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm just going to diverge a little bit to an issue that we haven't yet named today, which is thinking about sort of around the notion of equity. How do you ensure that equity is front and center? And just to give you, and it hides beneath all of this conversation. So you heard earlier today that Massachusetts is tops in the nation. You probably heard that. But a little known fact is that Massachusetts also is in the top third or quarter of districts of states that have the largest achievement gaps by race, income, and language. So with all the ballyhoo that we get, we actually aren't doing so hot, particularly since Massachusetts, like every other state, is increasingly diverse. We have more immigrants, more English language learners, more low-income kids, more Black and Latino kids than we've ever had. So our challenge is to figure out how to close that gap. And 2 points from just a couple of studies we released on Black and Latino boys in the Boston Public Schools a couple years ago. One is that it's opportunity gaps, access for Black and Latino students that produce achievement gaps in multiple different ways. And the second was an interesting one. We reported on the bad news, but we wanted to do a good news study. So we picked 4 schools, looking for 4 schools that were so-called beating the odds. Sadly, out of 125 schools, our research team found that there was not one school that was statistically beating the odds with Black and Latino boys. So we looked for 4 that were doing incrementally better. So they found some good, and we sent 4 different Black and Latino research teams because we wanted to get different perspectives out to see what was going on in those schools. And there were some things we found that were the same, like good things like professional collaborative communities, high expectations, differentiated instruction, and at the elementary level, parent engagement. But it's what they didn't find that was the most striking finding of all, which was a complete lack of systemic cultural competency of the adults. And it was their posit that it was that was preventing those schools from moving from incrementally better to statistically significantly better. So the most extreme example is in one school of 40% Latino kids, they decide to hold a Cinco de Mayo Day. Now, does anybody know the country of origin of Cinco de Mayo? Mexico. Well, if you know Boston, There wasn't one Mexican kid of Mexican descent in this school. It's all Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. The point being, if you don't deeply, deeply know your kids, their culture, their language, their experiences, their backgrounds, we aren't going anywhere on the equity conversation.
I think that's a really critical reminder, Dan, and a theme that we've heard so much throughout the day. I think something that's come up in recent conversations too, we've talked about as we engage in equity conversations, that for many communities this is a heightened time for either engagement or watchfully monitoring policies that have an impact above and beyond education. So something I've heard in the room too is just thoughtfulness around how this community can engage around the intersection of issues. I'd love to welcome the panel, and if there are reactions on that front, I think it's both critical that we maintain laser focus on priorities we're driving on, and at the same time acknowledge certain challenges that communities are up against, as well as the significant impact that policies can have on that front. So I'd welcome reactions.
Go, I just talked. So.
That's been a central issue in our work. I mean, it is an equity project that we're working on, and we're thinking about how to build systems of support that includes kind of fully the lives of kids, and so this issue of the experiences that they're having in their communities is front and center. So we've woven it throughout our convenings. We had a very powerful keynote talk by Dr. Michael McAfee from Policy Links at our last convening that really challenged each of our teams to think deeply about how these issues play out broadly in their communities, but even in the dynamics among the teams, which all are quite diverse. But it really generated some really thoughtful, candid conversations that teams reported were really productive and needed. So,
I think particularly relating to the issue of the other than education issues that are happening, advocacy and winning at advocacy is partially storytelling and being there and being good at that. It's also partially power structures. So I think, DACA, DREAM Act is one thing that's always on everyone's minds. Like, those of you in the room that partner with other people, I think it's also time to hold hands with people you don't hold hands with a lot, and to offer your political power to people who may have less, and vice versa based on the issue. Because I don't think it's ever going to be enough if we don't do that. And it's hard because, for example, district superintendents, they probably get asked to sign 1,000 letters, state chiefs too, on every issue that's ever known in the education, social services, youth services, immigration world, right? It's hard, and you may or may not have the political power to do it, but I would say this is time to stretch that political power as far as you can, because it really matters. Can I take a minute? Another thing I've been thinking about, and I put this out there because I keep hearing this word innovation and equity together. And when we think about how maybe some of you were disappointed that the accountability system in ESSA wasn't sort of innovative enough or flexible enough, just consider this, that when those decisions are made, you have the school systems, you have the parent systems, you have the civil rights, sort of traditional civil rights communities are very powerful, who are also our friends on DACA and other things. You have the innovation community that you are part of, you have unions. All of those folks are working together to create what we created. And all of them want equity. I'm not sure, and all of them want some kind of innovation. All of you do. I'm not sure we always marry those two and define them the same way, but I hear the same language all the time. So one of the challenges, I think, is we're looking in a room of innovators, and we keep talking, and I can't say this for sure because I don't know, but we keep saying but we include the unions, but we include so-and-so. But the reality is the people who fought, I don't want to argue about NCLB either way because we have different opinions, but the people who thought they were really building equity in NCLB was the civil rights community. So we have to remember that good, and maybe it didn't work out the way we all wanted, but I think we need to start bridging some of these conversations so the next time everyone's on the same page and we're not having innovation over here as though it's different from equity, and we're not trying to convince ourselves that we are equity, that in fact all of us are saying equity is the same thing, which is some other form of assessments and accountability, in my opinion. So I think that's a huge challenge and an opportunity in the next 7 years for everybody in this room to be working on together. I say 7 years because that's like probably the life of the law, more or less. But anyway, that's my big thought. You can all throw darts at me later, but
Over
Cocktails.
Yeah, I think it's a really critical point, Danica, and opens up a really vibrant conversation. I'd encourage folks, feel free to react to that on the Slido, and we'll pull you into the conversation. Dan, did you want to jump in?
Well, someone wrote, we also need to scrap the idea that we want state-level systems that grade good schools on an A to F scale. Argument is parents need easy info. So around this school quality framework that I told you about, it was piloted by a colleague in Somerville. For those of you who don't know, Massachusetts is a small urban district just north of Boston. For a couple of years. And once they had the data dashboard up, they brought in 2 groups of people from the community. And they gave them data on the same set of 3 schools. One group got the state data, which is just test scores. The other group got all the information, the multiple information from the data dashboard. Now, because it's Somerville, which has high percentages of low-income kids and kids of color and English language learners, their test scores are not all that great. So the parents decided, the control group said, these are not very good schools, something needs to be done. The other group, which got the contextualized data, came up with a contextualized assessment. Well, this school is doing really well over here in school culture, but it might need to improve in math over here. Safety is really great, et cetera, et cetera. The point being, to get at that notion of parents need easy info, we need to trust the community out there. When you give them complex, nuanced information, they're perfectly capable of understanding it. And so it's an easy way out to say we have to package it into one test score. That's just not true.
Really appreciate that.
I agree.
Did you want to
I would
react
just
on
say
it?
that the way in which we deliver that information
Yes.
could sometimes be clearer.
We do.
But the
Yes,
idea
I
that we
agree.
can
I agree with that too. I agree with that.
There's a meeting of the minds in real time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I really appreciate that. I think we've covered so much ground here today, and one thing that I want folks to take away from this panel is that we can't let up on this work. It's something that our coalition asks us about all the time, and I think that's our resounding and consistent answer. On every front, we can't let up. We have to be thinking about where we go next. We have to be thinking about pulling more folks in, developing a broad and robust agenda, and continuing to push on every front. I'd love to offer each panelist maybe a closing comment and a lot of gratitude for being in this work with us.
So my last point is a point we haven't hit on yet, which is at the district level. We need to get away from that the people in central office know more than the people in the field. And put our trust, and Jeff talked about this, is how do you create school districts that are decentralized, where you're putting as much of your resources back into schools and trusting in the teachers, and you're there really to support innovation. That's your role. It's not compliance, it's innovation, which also means trimming down central office to just those essential services, because there's a lot of services in central office that the district benevolently decides are important for schools to get but are not essential. Schools should have the discretion of whether they want those services or they want the money. This is something we do with autonomous schools in Boston, and I'll tell you, 90+% of all the discretionary money goes straight into the school's budget instead of the services.
Yeah, I would just briefly say this panel is, the title of it was about advancing educational equity, and I think for all the reasons people have discussed, for better or worse, it's now incumbent upon all of us more than ever before, I think, to push at all the levels that folks have mentioned.
I feel like I did my close before.
It was a strong close, and you're getting great feedback, so. No, we really appreciate that. And I think that's a good push for us too, Danica, as a community to just be thinking about the work ahead. I know we're playing a lot of defense right now, and we talk about that frequently. And we need a strong offense too. So, you know, need your second baseman
Better
and your DH.
translation.
And yeah.
So I just put a plug in from my experience in the first half of my career, which is now becoming the first third of my career. I was a teacher and elementary school administrator. Then I worked for the state, and now I'm working through higher ed in partnership with the cities that I mentioned. Whatever we can do through policy, through philanthropy, to provide time for practitioners at all levels to think, plan, and implement, in my opinion, is the best investment that we can be making. We see that with our teams and these convenings that I've described. When I worked on innovation schools for the state, that to me was the best investment of the resources that we had. And leading a school, I know the time that I was able to carve out for my staff to think and plan. The systems are just overwhelmed. People don't have that time and space. So that's my plug.
That's a great point. Well, thank you all so much for your time and your insights and for being in this work with us.